Good evening and welcome to Insight. On this episode, we will be discussing Iran's strategic naval force with the commander of Iran's Navy, Admiral Shahram Irani. But first, let's take a look at this brief analysis.
In the early 20th century, U.S. Navy Admiral Alfred Mahan theorized that in order for a nation to be the primary global power, it needs to control all the major naval choke points located in the world's oceans and seas. He theorized about the vital geostrategic importance of what he named, quote, the Middle East, the area that is Western Asia and the connecting point between Asia, Africa, and Europe. His views were enthusiastically adopted by the British Empire, the dominant empire of the time, who in the wake of the decline of the Ottoman Empire began to dominate the region. This meant that no local nation was allowed to develop naval power as a rival to Britain, including Iran, which had a naval tradition going back to ancient history. The United States inherited the strategy of global naval dominance following World War II, when it became the inheritor of the British Empire, including the part related to not allowing regional nations such as Iran to develop their naval capabilities. All this changed after the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the imposed war in the 1980s, which saw Iran gradually develop its navy into the strategic force that it has become today. Today, the Iranian Navy is challenging the lie spread by the U.S. Navy that it is providing so-called security in the region by providing real security in cooperation with other regional nations and advocating the expulsion of all foreign navies from the region and showing that their presence in the region is redundant. The Iranian Navy has also shown its ability to fly the flag in distant seas, from the Caribbean Sea and Latin America to the English Channel and the North Sea to the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. As Iran takes its place as a rising power in the post-American multipolar global order, so will its strategic naval power increase, and the world will witness its permanent naval presence in the world's oceans and seas in cooperation with its strategic partners from around the globe.
Admiral Shahram Irani, commander of the Iranian Navy, thank you so much for joining us on Insight. As we spoke before the program, our program tries to look at the current events and the events that occur in the news from a more strategic and historic perspective. In our previous programs in the past 2 seasons, we've talked a lot about the geostrategic plans and geostrategic different views that have existed among Western strategic planners, all the way beginning with Halford Mackinder, which were more focused on land and on issues related to the army and geo, in terms of land and geostrategics. And we mentioned very briefly in some parts the marine and naval aspect of this, which at the same time as this was happening at the end of the 19th century and the 20th century, we have people like Admiral Mahan in the United States theorizing this global British, American, Anglo-American empire from a marine perspective. The idea that in order for Britain and then America as the inheritor of the British Empire following World War II, in order for them to rule the world, they have to control all the strategic choke points, marine choke points in the world. Places such as the Strait of Hormuz, Bab al-Mandab in Yemen, Suez Canal, Eastern Mediterranean, the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, Straits of Bosphorus, exactly our region of the world, the most important strategic region, as they have been claiming for over 100 years. And I wanted to get your more technical analysis of this, the fact that maybe for the first time in this 100 years, we have a local power after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, when it was already starting to decline, that we have for the first time in this region a local power increasing and showing its power both in terms of its land forces but also its navy. And we are at the point now where we have the leader of the Islamic Revolution declaring the Navy of the Islamic Republic of Iran to be a strategic navy that has to go all around the world to defend Iran's interest and to project Iran's power. So I would like to begin our conversation with your analysis of this historic background and how we can tie it in with what's happening today in Iran.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. خیلی خوش آمدید. خدمتتون عرض بکنم که همونطور که اشاره فرمودید خب منطقه ما یه منطقه بسیار راهبردیه.
In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, warm greetings to you all. I would like to emphasize that, as you mentioned, our region is a very strategic one. The Indian Ocean region, especially the northern part, is considered to be very special thanks to its straits and waterways. The second reason is that this region is the connection point of 3 continents. In addition to these points, the most important feature of this region is that it is a global economic highway. When we talk about the 3 continents, the Americas are also indirectly affected. This conveys a clear message about the characteristics and the strategic of this region. But first, I want to describe the significance of the sea. About 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. 80% of the world's population live at least 200 kilometers from coastal areas, and developed cities were mostly established next to the coast or its close hinterland. Today, it is rare to see these newer cities on the coast or on the banks or even behind the coast, which was previously common among people. 90% of global trade is done through sea. The reason is a term in geopolitics called access advantage. That is, the sea gives you access advantage, and one can be present wherever the sea permeates, and the dimensions of this influence are unlimited, as this can be from bays to the oceans. Well, the point you mentioned regarding the fact that in the past 100 years, some people have noticed its significance in terms of political geography and have focused on this field is absolutely correct. But I would like to go back a little further. Looking at the past, we must pay attention to the fact that, in line with colonial policies, they always pretended that they have the upper hand in the field of science and knowledge, and the output of this science and knowledge becomes industry. And the manifestation and crystallization of this industry emerges in the marine field. When you vacate and abandon the coast from the very beginning, you've actually assisted the policy that the colonialists have pursued from the beginning, the policy of creating fear and nightmares in the hearts of the residents of these coastal areas about the sea. According to the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khamenei, wherever our people went into the sea, they only went knee-deep and did not dare to go further and experience the depth of the seas and oceans. Well, how was this fear imposed on our people and the people of this region? The answer is that since our countries were rich in natural and underground resources, especially hydrocarbon reserves, they occupied us with the center and pushed us away from the coast. And they created a situation that the only attraction of the seaside for our people was to travel to the north or south of the country to enjoy watching the sunrise and sunset, and that's it. Well, this was a diversion. On the other hand, they tried to highlight 1 or 2 people in this field. For example, as you mentioned, Alfred Thayer Mahan, an American naval officer who opposed a theory that if someone wants to dominate the world, he must dominate the seas. So what does this dominance mean? Simply put, it means presence in the sea. This is very clear. Now let's get back to the maritime history of the Iranian nation. When you look at the corners of this ocean, Iranians are present in many countries. Now my question is, how were these Iranians be able to immigrate to these countries? At that time, there were no airplanes, and it was not possible to construct a road on the sea. Now, it's not a secret that the Iranian nation has dominated the seas before these Westerners had maritime power. This maritime power includes science, education, industry, ship production, and more, which I'm not going to go into much detail now. These Iranians have gone to places in the Indian Ocean region and further to China, where they must have traveled there by sea. Well, in the first stage, colonialism created a historical disconnection between the Iranian nation and the sea, and it diverted our attention from the seas towards the center, and this created the illusion in the Iranian people that the sea is a scary thing. Even in their movies, they presented the sea with terrifying storms and creatures such as giant octopuses and sharks. But inside their own countries, they created the belief that the sea is a very kind environment. Whales are our friends, and you can even get close to sharks. Well, they tried to create a bond and connection between themselves and the sea, but fear and worry between Iranians and the sea. This policy of colonialization caused us to fear maritime presence and avoid the seas. Now, what is important in the matter of maritime presence is authority. As you mentioned, presence in the seas means power and authority. This stems from the fact that the sea is the embodiment of power and, in the words of the leader, the power of your naval force and combat unit in the sea. It is there that you can see the peak of authority. The first message that a frigate or a submarine sends out is that the country that builds them has acquired the required knowledge to dominate the sea. When you reach a continuity of presence in the sea, it shows that your country has gained the ability to achieve the two characteristics of stability and permanence. Third, your country has succeeded in turning its knowledge into an industry and can remove the fear and illusion created by the colonial powers. Well, when this happens, you have taken a very big historical step. One of the messages that was institutionalized in our people and brought about by the glorious Islamic Revolution of 1979 was that the Iranian nation can achieve whatever it wants, and it can achieve whatever it is determined to achieve. But what is the foundation of this movement? It is definitely the people. It means that human power comes first. But the point is that the human force that is supposed to be present in the sea and symbolically display your authority must be a special human force. It should be a force that goes through the training courses properly, learns science properly, never surrenders to the harsh environment of the sea. Because you as a sailor must first fight with the nature. That is, your first war is with nature, and your next war is with the enemy, who wants to encroach on you from this path or play a hostile role. Well, it turned out like this in our country, that when the Iraq-Iran war broke out, a historic operation was carried out in the sea in the shortest possible time during the 8-year sacred defense. There was an impression that the Iranian Navy is a completely dependent force. And of course, this impression was completely correct, because first, naval training was held abroad before the Islamic Revolution. Second, naval equipment had to be provided from abroad. And in fact, no equipment belonged to the Iranian Navy, and it had no plans for military independence either. Third, the base of its maintenance and stability and its presence in the sea were the military advisors who were present in Iran before the revolution. At first, after the revolution, if a vessel, for example, went to the sea and something went wrong, we couldn't do anything anymore. You had to find a military advisor, and he would go to the sea to repair the vessel, and more importantly, they would not allow you to enter such specialized areas at all. Even the limited training they gave were at the user level. As a result, when the revolution occurred because of this unfavorable situation and the military advisors leaving the country, a happiness was formed in the hearts of the colonialist powers, because they assumed that the policy and the doctrine or strategy that they had applied had yielded results, and Iran was left with a paralyzed navy which only owned a bunch of limited equipment and no knowledge, and it would not be able to do anything. Thus, a war was imposed against Iran, and this was where the will of Iranians and their religious, cultural, and national teachings showed themselves and rushed to help Iran. From the very place that the enemies assumed would be Iran's weak point, Iran's navy dealt the strongest and deadliest blow to the enemy. That is, in less than 67 days into the war, we could cut off the economic artery of the enemy and in fact completely eliminated the enemy's presence in the sea. It came as a shock to everyone. At that moment, they suddenly came to their senses and realized that they were wrong. Well, despite having the equipment, Iran had no knowledge. So how did it manage to become a power in the sea? This is the starting point. The starting point is here. The period of history that you mentioned has a history like this. That is, first there was fear and illusion about being in the sea. And then there was a disconnection from the sea. The will of the Iranian nation removed that disconnection and created the possibility of being in the sea. What happened? The enemy, who was in the guise of Iraq's Ba'athist regime and Saddam, tried to come and take possession of the sea again, which means that the same policy and doctrine that you brought up earlier was behind this case, gaining dominance by missile war or by airplanes. It is always asked that 67 days into the war, Iran had managed to completely remove the enemy's navy from the scene. It cut off Iraq's economic artery. So what is the point of having continuous presence in the sea while it had nothing else to do? Well, no, that wasn't the case. The enemy did not give up aggression and resorted to other measures to strike Iran. It tried to target Iran's economy as a countermeasure. That's exactly why we convoyed about 10,000 cargo ships and tankers and ensured their security during the 8-year sacred defense. Among these 10,000 ships, 252 were threatened by the enemy's attacks, of which less than 10 to 15 ships sank and the rest managed to reach the shore safely thanks to Iran's help. Well, here the economic artery of the country remained stable, and this stability is not only limited to the sea, but also transferred to the land, and the necessities of life of the people were provided. Well, we passed this stage too. So what happened? For 8 years, we had to fight back in a war waged by Iran's enemies. We did not have much time. Our military equipment wore out and the combat units were exhausted. So does this mean that the maritime presence was no longer needed and we should have given up? No, this presence must continue. Here actually began a new chapter in the history of Iran's naval force that continues to this day. What happened? In the last days of the war, April 18, 1989, the great Satan, the United States, became so desperate that it directly attacked this exhausted naval force. The U.S. Navy, in a cowardly fashion, entered into a direct war with Iran with all its might. In this war, our Sabalan frigate was damaged.
درگیر مستقیم میشه و ناوشکن سبلان ما صدمه میبینه.
So, excuse me, Admiral, so you're saying that we come to the point in the war where the Americans become so desperate because they're seeing that their puppet, Saddam, and the Ba'ath Army and Navy is not able to fulfill its duty according to the Americans. It reaches the point where the largest, most powerful navy, as they call it, directly enters into the war and directly fights against the Iranian navy. This is what you're trying to tell us. Is that correct?
من اجازه میخوام که اینو یه مقدار بازتر بکنم. اشاره فرمودید به یک کشور.
Okay, let me open this up a little bit more. You said one country, but it wasn't like that. The West and the East united against our country and joined hands to line up against us. And the result was that not only the Iraqi Ba'athist regime, but also the Eastern and Western worlds were disappointed. That is, they saw what they had hoped for, and none of their strategic actions were fruitful. The seedling of the revolution grew and grew tall and became very strong and did not stop. Therefore, they entered the war directly, and their war against the Iranian nation was completely cowardly. They did not dare to fight face to face. There was not supposed to be any clashes between Iran and the U.S. at all. Well, our enemy was defined in the war. In appearance, it was the Ba'athist regime of Iraq, and everyone supported him. But here, America enters directly and targets our frigate with a laser-guided bomb. One of our frigates sinks into the sea. It was named Sahan. and it belonged to the Islamic Republic. Of course, we have built a better one today. From here on, as I said, a new chapter of our history begins. The naval force rescues the Sabalan frigate, along with its commander and staff, and brings it to the shore while its spine was damaged. Based on all mathematical, scientific, technological, and industrial formulas, it was impossible for them to remain on the water. But the will of the Iranian Navy managed to bring this frigate back to the shore. So what happened then? Was the frigate thrown away? Of course not. The next will of the Iranian nation is manifested here. That is, the decision is made to repair Sabalan frigate, which is completely achieved. But under what conditions? Under the conditions of sanctions, threats, and constant conspiracy. In the end, fortunately, the Sabalan destroyer returns to the field of naval operations in the shortest possible time, and this is where the country's universities and Iranian youth enter the scene of the scientific campaign at the same time. Operational and military experiences are transferred to them, and they are informed about what is happening in the world. With the help of the Iranian elite and scientific community, the Sabalan frigate is built. However, it is no longer the previous frigate, except for the body and the outer shell. Its missile system and its sonar system undergo many changes. When the young generation manifests this ability, here the commander-in-chief of the Iranian Armed Forces, Ayatollah Khamenei, announces a new command. After visiting the progress of the work, he asks, "Why don't you enter the construction phase?" and issues this historical decree. That is, at the very beginning of the work, we go for building frigates. The leader further said, "Build a frigate, build a good one that can also carry helicopters." At that time, our frigates could not carry or accompany helicopters. They did not have a flight deck. Therefore, a new phase begins here. We began with repair and overhaul, and then moved towards improvement of the equipment, and this progress continued until we gained the knowledge of building military equipment. At that time, we felt the need that it's time to go underwater. Therefore, the first subsurface vessels were purchased, 3 submarines. But can this help us if a crisis occurs? Again, the answer is no, because the knowledge did not belong to us. Therefore, at this point, the country's navy enters the field of submarine construction, and fortunately, today we have the ability to build 2 classes of submarines. Well, how do you expect your enemy, who is under the illusion that the world's seas belong to them, to feel when they see your naval power? Certainly, it'll experience a feeling of geopolitical suffocation, because it sees in front of it, or next to it, a navy that has grown and is standing on its own feet, a navy whose entire support comes from its people, its youth, and has relied on its own universities and industry. A navy which has no problems to be present in the seas and wants to reassert itself. This is a historical moment for the Iranian Navy, and a new chapter is beginning, which is called the Strategic Navy, according to the leader of the Islamic Revolution. Well, here it is necessary to reiterate that, as you said, the environment of this region is very special. Among all these seas, the northern Indian Ocean is distinctive and exceptional. The enemy is trying to make this area unsafe through piracy.
بسیار بالایی داره. اینجا رو ناامن میکنه. به چه شکلی؟ دزدی دریایی.
That's very interesting, because if we look at history, we see that the British and other Western powers actually used pirates as part of their global naval strategies. The famous pirates that are maybe known in history were actually part of a larger naval strategy by the British to indirectly engage and to attack their enemies without having to suffer the consequences of having a direct naval confrontation with the rival powers that they were doing. So what you're saying is that this policy still exists today, that a lot of the things that were called Somali pirates, or the pirates that existed in the northern Indian Ocean, in the Bab al-Mandab area, were actually pirates and forces that were connected to the Americans and the Western naval forces.
اینجا یه نکته ویژه وجود داره، شاید پنهان خیلی بهش.
There's a special point here that may be left unsaid and is not being paid much attention to. When does this happen and at what point? Where in the Indian Ocean? It happens in an area in the Indian Ocean where there is no navy. None of these countries have naval power, unfortunately. That is, you should note that from the countries on the shores of the Persian Gulf to those on the shores of the Red Sea and Suez Canal, no one has a naval power. How do you explain this situation? The message it sends out refers to the same doctrine that you mentioned. That is, they have chosen a strategy to insinuate that they are the only ones who are able to be present at the sea and bring security. That is, if the area becomes insecure, there will be no one around to come to the rescue. In that case, they can safely announce that they are the only ones who can protect and guard you. They intend to convince the countries of the region that they are the only one, that they are the only sea power available. So what happened? At that time, one of our ships was also hijacked by these pirates. That's when a new chapter in the history of the country's navy began. Since 2009, a decree was issued that the strategic navy of the Islamic Republic of Iran is responsible for the security of our shipping and the task of protecting the economic artery of the country.
Do I understand you correctly? So we're talking about the security of all ships in that area. It's not only about the Iranian ships that would be coming and going. Of course, they have the priority, but in a way, Iran is saying to the world that Iran is capable of doing what they've been saying that they are the only ones that are capable of doing. That if they don't exist, then there's no security in the seas. But Iran is showing that yes, even if they're not there, Iran can give the security to that region of the world, that very important strategic region of the world. Did I understand correctly what you're saying?
Okay, here I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this growth is realized step by step. In the first step, we have an order that the security of Iran's shipping lines should be maintained. When you have presence in a region and you establish security for yourself, the whole region benefits from that security. In the big picture, this security expands its borders. That is, in fact, the country of Iran has gifted this security to the world because the ships of all countries of the world pass through this area.
So in other words, what you're saying is that we are hitting the very basic argument that they have been making for over 100 years, which is that we are the ones that give security, naval and marine and security on the seas. And yet Iran has now come into the scene and is saying to them and to the world that there's no need for the Americans or for the Westerners to be here. We, as a local nation, as a local power, are able to give this security not only for ourselves but for the whole world. And there's no need for these foreigners to come from tens of thousands of miles away to do this. Did I understand this correctly?
Yes, it is exactly the same, but I want to share a point with you. During this period, since 2009, we have convoyed more than 5,000 ships belonging to the Islamic Republic. We had more than 200 direct clashes with pirates. It is interesting for you to know that among the 20 ships we saved, one belonged to the Americans and they asked us for help. The help request was actually in an area where they claimed to be present. You correctly used the word lie, but I say a monstrous lie. Claiming that they want to establish security is not a white lie, but a bare-faced big lie. They were not even able to help their own ship. They didn't help other ships either. In one case, they had a clash with pirates in which members from both their own forces and the crew of the ship they were trying to save were killed. But the Iranian Navy had 2 direct skirmishes without a single casualty. We have had more than 200 clashes to this day, but we did not hurt even one pirate, because in our opinion, these are not thieves. These are poor people who are being abused. And it is necessary for the people of the world to know that we arrested a number of pirates in one of the naval operations against pirates when we saved a Chinese vessel. But we did not take these arrested thieves or pirates to Guantanamo to perform immoral and inhumane experiments on them. They are human beings like us. So they all came to the Islamic Republic of Iran and took training courses and learned jobs. Then they returned to their own countries and engaged in various professions, including carpentry and tailoring, and the jobs they were able to do, including mechanics and the fields that they were interested in, such as handicrafts. Today, those people are no longer thieves. I would like to share with you another point. Pay attention to these people who are stealing in the sea now. What kind of people are they? These are all Muslims. Our enemy wants to show the world that Muslims do not have the ability to govern themselves and therefore they commit crimes. But it's wrong. Muslims have many abilities. But unfortunately, they've been oppressed and they've been in a situation where they had to engage in a piracy. Now, what is the result of Iran's efforts? What happened? We were encouraged and appreciated in several stages, both in writings and at various meetings. But for what reason? Because although we had came to establish security and safety for our vessels, and we have always said, not changing slogans, that this region has the capacity and capability, and that the countries of the region can reject foreign forces and establish security together hand in hand. Here I feel a need to emphasize again that their ships also pass through this safe area. But nevertheless, they try to make it look unsafe in various ways. Well, here, as you said, a naval power has come to the scene, but this naval power today does not intend to boast about its capabilities. This is not our basis. The basis of our work is in the form of maritime or defense diplomacy. We carry the Iranian flag and proudly wave it in the seas and sail and defend the countries of the region. We pay visits to them and show our capabilities and deliver this message to all of them.
That's very interesting, Admiral. So I want to move a little bit further away from our own area, where you talked about the northern Indian Ocean. You talked about this area that we've been able to really establish security here without the need for any foreign powers. But we've also witnessed and we've also seen that the Iranian Navy is moving in all areas of the world. We've had the very famous and important mission to the Caribbean Sea and towards the Atlantic Ocean in Venezuela, which was, of course, everybody in the world was astonished to see that Iran was able to do this. We had the trip to St. Petersburg, which it went through the Mediterranean and up through the English Channel and towards the North Sea. Of course, we had some years back the mission that you were the commander of going through the Suez Canal for the first time in many years for the Iranian Navy and going into the Eastern Mediterranean. And also we see recently now that a naval group is going towards the east, the Straits of Malacca, Indonesia, and on to other areas. So if you could please briefly give us some details about every one of these missions and if there's anything in the future that we have plans for.
خدمتتون عرض بکنم که من یه کوچولو توضیح بدم که ما یک اجلاس فرماندهان حاشیه اقیانوس هند داریم با عنوان آیاز مخففشه.
You may want to know that there is an initiative named Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which includes 3 working groups: the Maritime Security Group, the Humanitarian Assistance in Disaster Relief Group, and finally the Information Sharing and Interoperability Group. Due to our maritime activities during this period, we have the honor of chairing 2 working groups, which in fact are the most important ones: the Maritime Security Group, in which most countries are members, and the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Group, which is relevant to the whole world. But on the issue you mentioned, I said that we use the advantage of access. We felt the need to go further and experience other sea and ocean areas. After all, we are sailors. We have the equipment. We also have the science. Well, you should know that when we were invited to attend an official ceremony in St. Petersburg, in respect to this invitation, we sailed this route steadfastly. During this period, we were subjected to numerous negative propaganda campaigns from the enemy. They spread lies against our Navy, claiming that we intend to make the region insecure, sell weapons and deliver arms, but we did not enter any country or dock at any port except St. Petersburg. Our Navy sailed 45,000 kilometers and crossed 2 or 3 oceans and seas. We crossed all those canals and waterways you mentioned and arrived at St. Petersburg, participated in the ceremony, and then returned. Our fleet proudly crossed the Suez Canal and returned to the country. Today, yes, we are present in the Straits of Malacca because our vessels are moving there. We will cover and convoy our ships every day. Well, it was a question for everyone whether the Iranian Navy has this ability and how it acquired this ability. Let me tell you a memory from this trip. During this trip, I experienced the hardest and most terrible storms that I had seen in all my years of sailing. A strong wind with speeds up to 160 kilometers per hour affected us for 8 days. The strength of the sea storms was so high that no vessel could sail nearby. No one. For all the countries there, it was surprising how the Iranian Navy was able to sail sustainably in this Mediterranean environment and in this very rough sea. We stayed there until the day the sea calmed down and displayed our sea prowess and then returned. Regarding the future, as you mentioned, this is our basis. Our basis is diplomacy. Our basis is friendship. Our basis is the exchange of capabilities. Our basis is not empty promises, and we never intend to boast. All the countries of the world have this will and power, but they should make an effort and be present in the sea themselves, and they can establish their own security. But here, because it is a region that belongs to different countries, our presence doesn't mean that others do not need to be present. The difference between the discourse of the Islamic Republic and the West is that we have always said that we would like to establish the security of the region with the cooperation of other countries. But they say that the security of the region can only be achieved by themselves, and that they only want to plunder our resources. See how different the discourse is? Iranians have a very rich and humanitarian culture. We have the highest respect for the human being that God created and brought on earth, and this is a lesson. It will be the same in the future and will be present in the sea with more modern facilities. Today, our people are demanding this because their knowledge has increased, their technology has increased, and our youth are proudly struggling day and night to see their soldiers in the sea more firmly and with more authority.
تلاش میکنند که سربازانشون رو در دریا استوارتر و با اقتدار بیشتری شاهد باشند.
It's interesting that you're mentioning that we've really gone in all various directions now and are present there, as you said, of course, in terms of showing our presence and going there in peace and trying to establish friendly relations with friendly nations who exist around the world. My question is this: are we going to maybe see in the future a time when the Navy of the Islamic Republic goes into the Pacific Ocean, maybe goes through the Panama Canal, goes to some of the countries that are maybe considered countries that they wouldn't have even dreamed of one day that the Iranian Navy would be passing by them? Is there anything in the future that you can tell us in this regard?
I want to deliver this message to all the people of the world that Iranians are very peaceful people with a humanitarian culture, and our country is not vulnerable despite all the conspiracies and efforts made by the distant enemy to harm it. The people of the world should know that if they're stuck in the middle of the seas in any way, the Iranian Navy will surely come to the rescue, even in the depths of the seas.
At the end of our conversation, I would like to ask you a question a bit more personal regarding your own life and the path you have taken in your own life. As you know, there have been issues now in Iran, and also this has been unfortunately exploited by our enemies, talking about the different ethnic groups that live in Iran. Of course, those of us who live in Iran know that none of that is true, that we live in peace here. All the different ethnic groups live in peace in Iran and are brothers and sisters of each other, and some of the things that are said are basic lies about what the reality is in Iran. You yourself were born in the beautiful province of Kurdistan, and it's very interesting, I think, for our audience to hear what happened in your own life. Kurdistan is very far from the sea. It's not a coastal area, it's actually a mountainous area, very far from the sea. So how is it that a young man from Kurdistan comes towards the sea and ends up being the commander of the Navy of the Islamic Republic of Iran?
First of all, I would like to use this opportunity to extend my blessings and appreciation to Iranian Kurds, my fellow citizens, and thank them for not being deceived by the enemy. This issue is not only limited to this day, but for decades the enemy has been trying to abuse this issue of ethnic tension and create discord. Of course, it is not only the issue of ethnic differences, but the enemy also tries to create divisions within the country through sowing discord among Shias and Sunnis. All the efforts by the enemies to create unrest in Iran at the borders have so far failed, thanks to the unity that exists among the different ethnic groups who live in the border areas. Therefore, I would like to extend my warmest greetings and appreciation to all of them. And finally, about myself, I must say that during the war, my father fought on land against the enemy aggression, but I myself was interested in experiencing new environments since my childhood, and I had a special interest in the sea. My dream was to sail across the Indian Ocean someday and reach Australia. When I finished high school, one day I came across a Navy ad on TV. The advertisement went like this: join the Navy and see the world. Well, it was a difficult decision, you're right. Someone who is thousands of kilometers away from the sea now wants to go and experience an environment that he has no knowledge of. Perhaps our only experience with water was the public pools where we swam. In any case, I entered because of my initial interest. At that time, the issue of naval war was not discussed much in the newspapers, because in the first 6 to 7 days of the war, the maritime clash was actually over. I was interested to know more about naval war. Therefore, I entered the Imam Khomeini Naval University of Nowshehar and completed my bachelor's degree specializing in navigation and ship command, and then went to the southern coast, and as time passed, my interest in the sea grew deeper. There's a saying among sailors which says, the sea is such that going in is in the hands of the captain, but returning is in the hands of God. At sea, whether you like it or not, you will be directly connected with God. Well, I continued this path in my life, and today, for me as a Kurd who has come from the western part of the vast and beloved country of Iran, it is a great honor that the leader Ayatollah Khamenei found me trustworthy and entrusted me with the Islamic Republic of Iran's strategic navy, which is completely equipment-oriented. My comrades are special and very distinguished. From here, I send my gratitude to them all and kiss their hands in appreciation of their constant efforts to properly display the dimensions of Iran's authority at sea. I think I gave the necessary explanations, but if there is any question, I'm at your service.
Admiral Irani, thank you so much for joining us on Insight. And if there's anything else you would like to tell us, if there's anything left out that you didn't have a chance to say, please, we have a few minutes left.
As you mentioned, we have the experience of dispatching naval fleet from the west to Venezuela and the Caribbean coast. So we've been there before, and we have convoyed our ships. As a result, I believe we will be definitely invited and will not reject any invitation, because we want this friendly relationship and mutual respect to be stable. We will definitely attend because we see no limitations. And hopefully, if the countries of South and Central America invite us, we will definitely be proud to attend, and we will be happy to have maritime relations with those dear ones.
Thank you so much for joining us on Insight. So what insight did we gain from our conversation with Admiral Irani? Despite the massive advancements in aerospace technology that humanity has experienced in the last century, the oceans and the sea remain the dominant form of economic and commercial interaction among humanity. And the existence of naval capabilities remains a vital necessity for most nations. Ancient nations with ancient naval traditions, such as Iran, were not allowed to develop their naval capabilities in the era of Anglo-American global naval dominance in the 19th and 20th century. Particularly in West Asia, the geostrategically most important region of the world. Following the Islamic Revolution and the imposed war, Iran began to gradually develop its navy into a strategic force which today is providing maritime security in the region and flying the flag in distant seas from Latin America to Northern Europe to East Asia. This is a result of the general awakening of the Iranian nation following the Islamic Revolution, which has resulted in Iran rapidly advancing in all social, political, economic, technological, scientific, and military fields, including naval power. Iran is establishing a permanent naval presence in the world's oceans and seas in cooperation with its strategic partners from around the world, with a focus on joint security and naval diplomacy, but also power projection when necessary. Thank you for joining us on this episode. Until the next time, on Insight.